here in question 4, it says we should calculate the consumer and producer surplus before and after the imposition of the tax and illustrate the efficiency loss. Let's do that. And in order to do it, we need a sketch. We need a sketch of the equilibrium before and after the introduction of the tax. In other words, we need the supply and demand curves. And then initially we had a quantity here equal to 30. Let's call it Q1. Then we introduced the tax. And please note, this time I won't ruin my sketch by having shifted curves. So I will just state here that we now get a new quantity here equal to Q2. And if you want to, you can write here that we of course find it where the vertical distance between the two curves is equal to the tax, because we found the quantity by either shifting the demand supply curve upwards by the tax intersecting here, or the demand curve down by the tax intersecting here. Then we had a price initially equal to 70. And then after the introduction of the tax, the consumer price increased to 80 and producer price decreased to 50. So that's a sketch showing the equilibria before and after the introduction of the tax. Then we need to be able to refer to the areas in this sketch, and we do that by putting on some letters at various corners here on the sketch, and we need the following letters: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. And then we can make a small table here showing the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, and then please leave an empty row here in the table before and after the introduction of the tax. And then the point of that is that we both tell the person who's going to grade our paper that we know where the different surpluses are, but also that we make ourselves aware of it so that we can calculate the relevant ones. Now let's start by finding the consumer surplus before the introduction of the tax. And hopefully you will then, after having given it some thought, you will then realize that the consumer surplus before the introduction of the tax corresponds to the area here A, C, G, because consumers pay 70 and the consumer surplus should be the area above the price, below the demand curve, to the left of the quantity. In other words, area A, C, G. After the introduction of the tax, the consumer price increases to 80 and consumers now only buy 20 units. So now the consumer surplus will be the area above the price, below the demand curve. In other words, A, B, H. With respect to the producer surplus, which, if you want to understand this fully, you should think about the curve here as a marginal cost curve, and then the producer surplus is the area before the introduction of the tax. It's the area G, C, E, the area underneath the price above the marginal cost curve, because the area underneath the marginal cost curve is the total variable cost, and the entire rectangle here has an area equal to revenue. So producer surplus is G, C, E. And finally, when the tax is introduced, the price for producers decreases to 50. So now the producer surplus is FDE, the area underneath the price above the marginal cost curve to the left of the quantity, FDE. And having then identified those areas, we can calculate them easily, because what you will see is that these are all right triangles. And when you want to calculate the area of a right triangle, then what you do is you take the two sides meeting at the right angle, and then you call those two the height and the base, and then the area is equal to 1/2 times the height times the base. So starting, for instance, with area ACG, which corresponds to the consumer surplus before, we really just need to find the height of this triangle and the base. And the base is easy because the base just corresponds to the quantity equal to 30. Then we need to find the height. However, that's not difficult. What we do is we look at the demand curve, the one we found, please note that, based on individual consumers' demand curves. And then we check 5 times in order not to make an error that on the left-hand side here it says P, which we've got on the vertical axis, but that it does. If it had said Q, then you would need to isolate first Q, but since it says P, then we can conclude that that constant here, the 100, corresponds to the vertical intercept. And when we know that, then we can see that the height of this triangle ACG is the difference between 100 and 70, in other words, 30. So the area here must be 1/2 times 100 minus 70. I know it's 30, but I write it so that you can see how I've calculated, times the base, which is 30. And this must be something around 450. If we look at the consumer surplus afterwards, it's also a right triangle, which now has a height equal to the difference between 180 and a base equal to 20, the new quantity. So we get here 100 minus 80 times 20, which is 200. If we then go to producer surplus before GCE, then it's also a right triangle. The base, GCE, is 30. The height we can't directly see, but what we can do is we can look at supply, which was 10 plus 2Q. And since we've been given inverse supply in the text, since we've got P on the left-hand side, then this 10, this constant, corresponds to the vertical intercept. Had it here said Q, had we had actual supply, you would need yourself to isolate P. But we've already got P isolated, so it says P here, and we can then see that the vertical distance here, the height of the triangle, is the difference between 70 and 10, in other words, 60. So we get here 70 minus 10 times the base, and this gives us, all in all, 900. And then finally, we have got FDE, which is a right triangle also. 1/2 times a height, which is the difference between 50 and 10. And a base, which corresponds to the new quantity, 20. And this gives us 400. And I think I will just slightly change my table up here, writing in a parenthesis underneath for later use that this then is equal to 450. This is equal to 200. And then the producer surplus here, which was GCE and FDE, they are equal to 900 and 400. And hereby we have done the part of the question which asks us to calculate the consumer and producer surplus before and after the imposition of the tax. What we should now also do, it says, is we should illustrate the efficiency loss. Now, what's that all about? And the answer is that's about, first of all, wiping this out. We've done the calculations. And that's about filling out a bit more of this table. Because what we're basically doing when making this table, and I don't mean doing the calculations because you're not always asked to do that, but what we're basically doing when we look at the consumer and the producer surplus before and after the imposition of the tax, what we're basically doing is we're looking at the welfare for all the parties who are involved in this market. And of course, in any market, you will always have consumers involved and you will have producers involved. So we should always look at consumer and producer surpluses. However, in this particular case where there is a tax, there is an extra party involved, and that party we call government. The point being that since this is about introducing a tax, then of course government will get some revenue. It will get some receipt from that tax. That's the reason why it collects the tax. That's because it wants to get a revenue. Why does government want to get a revenue? And the answer is because government got expenses. For instance, in Denmark, government has expenses on tuition, free tuition in grammar schools and universities. It's got expenses associated with healthcare systems. It's got expenses associated with student allowance, SU, which are paid to students. It's got a lot of expenses. And hopefully, those expenses benefit the people who get it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point in it. So when we want to look at the welfare of all the parties involved in this market, we should really also look at the benefit which comes from the fact that government collects money through the tax, which are then being spent on something beneficial. However, since we don't know who actually gets to benefit from this tax money, we just call it government. But it's important to understand that it's not actually government who keeps the money. The government spends the revenue on something which benefits either ill people or young people seeking tuition or students getting allowances or whatever. And we need to also take into account that fact. How do we do that? And the answer is we do that by me telling you that before the introduction of the tax, of course, government collects no money from the tax. After the introduction of the tax, however, government gets a revenue which in the diagram corresponds to the area HBDF. The rectangle here. Why? And the answer is because remember that the vertical distance here is equal to the amount of tax per unit, in other words, lowercase t, specifically 30. So this vertical distance corresponds to how much money is being collected in taxes per unit. And the length of the rectangle here corresponds to the quantity after the introduction of the tax. And since the tax revenue must be the amount of the tax per unit times the number of units being taxed, then that will correspond graphically here to the area of the rectangle HBDF. What we then want to do is we want to look at the total sum here. The sum of the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the government revenue. And I will do it initially without using the numbers. I simply want now to add together the areas here. And of course you can't, sometimes people at this point ask me, how do you add the letters together? And the answer is I don't. I add the areas together. So if we look at the situation before the introduction of the tax, consumers have got a consumer surplus corresponding to the area ACG, and producers have got a producer surplus equal to the area GCE. Since government then has got no revenue, then if we add together the consumer and the producer surpluses, we must get this entire area, which we could call ACE. After the introduction of the tax, consumers have got a consumer surplus equal to ABH, producers have got a producer surplus equal to FDE, and government has revenue HBDF. And if we add those areas together, we get something which corresponds to ABDE. And what we then see, if we compare these two, which we sometimes also call total welfare, because it's basically just the sum of welfare of all the parties involved in the market. What we then see is that after the introduction of the tax, the total welfare ABDE is lower than it was before. By how much? If we look at the sketch, and the answer is by the area over here, BCD. And that we call an efficiency or a welfare loss. And we then simply write that the efficiency loss, and please note, I write that. You don't have to do that as part of your solution, but I need you to know the term. Sometimes we don't call it an efficiency loss. We call it instead a welfare loss. And sometimes we call it a deadweight loss. But as I said, don't write that down. There is no point in bragging, but you need to know all the terms because I can't foresee which one they choose in a particular problem. But the important thing is that the efficiency loss, the welfare loss, the deadweight loss, whatever you call it, corresponds in the sketch to the area B, C, D, which we have been asked to sketch. Please note we haven't been asked to calculate it. But had we been asked to calculate it, and this is an extra, had we been asked to calculate it, the easiest way to do it, given that we've already got these numbers up here, would be to say that then we can calculate this, which is 0. I'm using blue to stress the fact that this is not part of the solution. The green ones were, but the blue ones are not. Then we can calculate HBDF, which is the rectangle which has a height equal to 30 and a base equal to 20. That must give us 30 times 20, that's 600. And what you can then do is you can add the numbers here together, 450 plus 900 plus 0, that's 1350, and 200 and 400 and 600, that's 1200, and then you can compare these two. So if you had been asked to calculate the efficiency loss, it would be equal to 150. But I'd like to stress that in the particular exercise, the way the questions have been posed, you have not been asked to do it, and you shouldn't do things you've not been asked to do, except, of course, explain how you got to the results. But you should not do calculations you have been asked to do, so we won't do it. Well, except now I have. But please note, you shouldn't necessarily. Now, the next thing we should do is we should explain the economic intuition for why the tax causes an efficiency loss. Let's do that. And there are two ways of thinking about it. And you should really state them both. I'll just wipe this out. The way we found it, I've just wiped it out, but the way we found the efficiency loss up until this point was by comparing the two sums here, the two total welfares, the total welfare of consumer, producer, and government before and after. And that's one way of thinking about the welfare loss. It's simply a loss in total welfare accruing to consumers, producers, and government. Let's write that. The welfare loss can be thought of as, and then we have two different ways of thinking about it. Either we can think about it as we have done up to now, in other words, as the difference here, as the decrease in total welfare in other words, the sum of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue. That's one way of thinking about it. And that is how we have found it so far, or that's how we have found it, because I said that the area BCG corresponds to the difference between these two. However, there is also another way of thinking about it, which has two virtues. One is that, in my opinion at least, it's more intuitive. The other reason is that it actually means that you can fight, and I will try to persuade you about that in a couple of minutes when I've gone through it. It also, the other way, means that you can actually fight the welfare loss in a couple of seconds. And please note that's important, because the way we have found the welfare loss until now here has been by first on the sketch to identify first consumer surplus before and after, and then producer surplus before and after, and then government revenue before and after. And then we have added it all together, finding total welfare. And then we have compared those two, and then the welfare loss is the difference. However, it takes quite a long time. And sometimes you are asked to find, not as we've been here, to find the consumer surplus before and after and calculating. Sometimes you're asked to simply find the welfare loss. And as we shall see, the second way of thinking about the welfare loss actually allows you to find it in 2 seconds. Now, what then is the other way of thinking about the welfare loss? The other way is to look at what happens when you introduce the tax. When you introduce the tax, the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, decreases from 30 to 20. Now, there is a good thing and there is a bad thing to that, the quantity decreasing. The good thing, of course, is that if society has to produce only 20 units rather than 30 units, then surely some costs must have been saved. It costs less to produce 20 units than to produce 30 units. And from a welfare point of view, that's a good thing, the fact that costs are lower. It basically means that some people can stay home from work and go fishing with their kids instead. And I'm not making fun, this is actually the welfare loss of producing less. There is, however, also a downside to the quantity decreasing. The downside is that now there are some consumers who can't buy the goods. They can't get hold of the goods because only 20 units are being bought and sold. And what that must mean is that those consumers who can no longer buy these 10 units, they must be experiencing a welfare loss, because since they bought those 10 units in the original equilibrium and they did it voluntarily, it must be because they wanted to buy those units, and then now where they can't buy them, they must in some sense be experiencing a welfare loss. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at those two sides of the coin separately. First, we're going to look at how much can society save by producing those 10 units less, and how much value, so to speak, do consumers put on those 10 units. In other words, how much are those 10 units, which the consumers can now no longer consume, how much are they worth to consumers? And then, as we shall see, the welfare loss is the difference between the two. But let's write here. The tax decreases the quantity from Q1 equaling 30 to Q2 equaling 20. And then we have 2 sub-points here. Thereby, cost will decrease by, and then I need to put 2 additional letters on my sketch here. I, J. And then I will write here that costs will now decrease by J, D, C, I. This area here, the area between the 2 quantities underneath the marginal cost curve. Because remember, the marginal cost curve tells you, if you look at it vertically, how much the cost of producing each unit of the good is. And if you take the cost of producing unit number 22, 21, 22, 23, 24, and so forth, and add it together, then you get the area here underneath the marginal cost curve. And and economically, you get the cost of producing those 10 units, and that cost is now being saved. But let's just write here in a parenthesis, area underneath MC. The second thing that happens when the quantity drops is that now some consumers can't buy 10 units of the goods. Also, consumers now cannot buy units which they, and now I'm going to find out how much value they put on those goods, which they value at. And then before moving on, I want to talk briefly, because now how can we figure out what value do consumers put on those 10 units? And the answer is, we're economists, so we measure everything in money. And when we want to figure out what's the value that consumers put on those 10 units, we simply ask, how much are consumers willing to pay for those 10 units? Because what consumers are willing to pay for those 10 units must reflect what they believe the goods are worth. What you want to pay, what you're willing to pay for something, must reflect what you think it's worth. And what are consumers willing to pay for those 10 units? And the answer is, remember that if you look vertically on the demand curve, you can see the price that the consumer buying that particular unit is willing to pay. And if you then add together what the person buying unit number 21 is willing to pay, if you add to that what the person buying unit number 22 is willing to pay, 23 and so forth, then you get graphically underneath, the area underneath the demand curve, and you must get, from an economic point of view, the value of that consumers put on those 10 units. But let's just finish the sentence in which they value at area J, B, C, I. So now what we've done here in point 1 and 2 is we have, up here in point 1, we have figured out what does it cost to produce those 10 units, which I'd like to stress once more are no longer produced. And then in point number 2, bullet 2 here, we have figured out how much value do consumers put on those 10 units. And then, of course, the idea is that now those 10 units are no longer being consumed because they're no longer being sold. And that must mean that, as seen from the point of view of consumers, they have now lost value corresponding to this. And what we see here is that the welfare loss is the difference between the value that consumers put on those units which they can no longer consume, and the cost which is being saved, JDCI. The point being that when the quantity decreases, then more value is being lost on the part of consumers. Consumers value those 10 units which are no longer being produced and consumed. Consumers value those units at a higher value than the cost which is being saved. And the difference between the value lost to consumers and the cost saved on the part of firms is exactly the welfare loss. And in my opinion, at least, that's a more intuitive way to think about the welfare loss. The problem here basically is that the reason for why the tax causes a welfare loss is that the tax causes the quantity to drop. And it's really not a very good idea for the quantity to drop if those units which are no longer being produced and consumed now are worth more to consumers if they were allowed to consume them than they cost to produce. And if nonetheless you lower the quantity by introducing a tax, then as a society as a whole, you will experience a welfare loss because some people in your society, namely consumers, have lost more than what other people, namely the firms, have saved. And that, as I said, in my opinion, is a more intuitive way to think about it, instead of just saying, as we did before, that the welfare loss is the total decrease in the total welfare, the sum of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue. Here we understand fully what's going on. The problem is that some units are no longer being produced and consumed, and that's a bad thing from a welfare point of view if those goods were worth more to consumers than what they cost to produce. That's point number one. Point number two, please note what this also means. This means that, I'll wipe this out, we've finished basically the question, not basically, we have finished the question, but please pay attention to one more fact. What this also means is that next time you need to find a welfare loss, if that's all you need to do, then you can actually find it in exactly 2 seconds. Because all you need to do is you need to look at the 2 quantities in the 2 equilibria that you have to compare. And then you look, don't calculate anything, that's the point. Then you look between those 2 quantities, you look at the area underneath the marginal cost curve. That corresponds to the area here, J, D, C, I. And then you look between those 2 quantities at the area underneath the demand curve, J, B, C, I. And then the difference between those 2 areas will be the welfare loss. And at this point, when I teach live, some people sometimes ask me, why do you make it so complicated, Michael? Why don't you just say that the welfare loss is the triangle? And the answer is because the whole point is that you should imagine that when you do this, when you find the welfare loss in 2 seconds, then there is no triangle. Just to be sure and just to revise, I've finished the question, but I need you to understand how you can find the welfare loss in 2 seconds. So let me just make a new sketch here. Suppose we have the original equilibrium where the quantity is 30. Then we have the new one where it's 20. The price originally is 70, then consumer price increases to 80 and producer price decreases to 50. And then suppose that in this situation, you're asked to identify the welfare loss. So this is the situation. And now the point is, I can't teach you that the welfare loss is just a triangle. Because if I do that, your first question will be, which triangle? I can see about 7 or 8 or 12 triangles in that diagram. So we need to teach you something that will actually work. And what will work is that you take and look between the 2 quantities at the area underneath the marginal cost curve. And then you also remember that this really corresponds to how much does it cost to produce those 10 units. Then you look between those 2, just look, don't calculate anything. You look between those 2 quantities at the area underneath the demand curve. And then you remember that this area corresponds to how much consumers are willing to pay for those quantities. In other words, and that must reflect how much they think those units are worth. And then without thinking, you can say that the deadweight loss must be the difference between those 2 areas. Let's abbreviate it, deadweight loss, DWL. And it all takes 2 seconds, and then afterwards you can then explain both to yourself and, if needed in the exercise, why it's the deadweight loss. It's the deadweight loss because when the quantity drops from 30 to 20, consumers are now no longer able to consume goods which they value at a total amount corresponding to the blue area. At the same time, firms save cost corresponding to the red area. But since firms save fewer costs than the value which consumers have lost, then society as a whole, society consisting of consumers and producers, have experienced a welfare loss. And that concludes both the question and the exercise.